What if you had everything money could buy, yet couldn't save the one person who mattered most? This is the story of a father who learned that truth in the hardest way, and a maid who proved that real miracles are not made of money, but of love. The doctor's voice came quiet and heavy. "Mr. Wilson, we've done everything we can. His body is failing. He has 7 days left." 7 days. That was all. Billionaire Robert Wilson stood frozen, staring at his 6-year-old son David, lying weak on the hospital bed. All his wealth, all his power, every doctor in Texas, none of it could buy one more heartbeat. At the corner of the room stood Sarah Lopez, the maid who had cared for David since birth. Her uniform was soaked from the rain, her hands trembling, her eyes full of tears she refused to let fall. To her, he wasn't just her employer's son. He was her own child in every way that mattered. No one knew it yet, but before those 7 days were over, Sarah would make a decision that would change everything. A choice that would break every rule, risk her own life, and leave the world in tears. The hospital lights were cold and bright, filling the room with a silence that hurt more than noise ever could. Machines hummed softly beside the small bed where 6-year-old David Wilson lay, his skin pale, his breath shallow. Every few seconds, a soft beep broke the stillness, like the slow ticking of time running out. Robert Wilson, the billionaire everyone in Texas knew as a man of power, sat in the chair beside the bed. His suit was wrinkled, his face unshaven. None of that mattered anymore. For the first time in his life, money had failed him. He had built towers across the state, owned companies that stretched across cities, yet he couldn't buy one thing that mattered: his son's life. The doctor's words still rang in his head. He has 7 days left. 7 days. That was all. After that, even the machines wouldn't be enough. Robert had tried everything, from the most expensive treatments in Houston to flying in foreign specialists. Every time he thought they found a solution, the tests came back worse. Now, all he could do was sit and watch. David's tiny hand rested on the blanket, fingers curled loosely, the same fingers that used to hold Robert's when they crossed the garden together. The boy used to laugh so hard that his voice filled the whole mansion. He loved riding his small bike down the marble hallway while Sarah scolded him playfully, pretending to be angry. That laughter was gone now. What replaced it was a silence that felt like punishment. At the edge of the room stood Sarah Lopez, the maid who had cared for David since he was born. Her black and white uniform was still damp from the rain outside. She had rushed from the mansion to the hospital the moment she heard the news. Her eyes were red, but she stayed composed. She didn't speak much, just watched David with quiet pain. Sarah had worked for Robert for 7 years. At first, she cleaned rooms and prepared meals, but soon she became part of the child's world. She fed him, helped him with homework, and stayed by his side through every fever and fear. David called her Mommy Number 2. The name had started one morning when he was only 3. He said it so naturally that everyone laughed. Even Robert. The name stayed. Now, Sarah stood watching that same little boy fighting for his life, her heart breaking with every shallow breath he took. Robert finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "He's getting weaker." Sarah nodded slowly. "He's trying, sir. He always tries." Her words were soft but heavy, and Robert could barely look at her. He didn't know how she stayed calm when he was falling apart inside. The nurse came in, adjusted the IV line, and left quietly. The smell of disinfectant filled the air, and Sarah reached out to wipe David's forehead with a clean cloth. She whispered, "It's okay, baby. Mommy Number 2 is right here." The boy's lips moved slightly, though no sound came out. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment. Robert leaned forward. "David?" he said quickly. David blinked once, his voice barely a whisper. "Daddy?" he said, weakly smiling. Robert swallowed hard. "I'm here, son. I'm not going anywhere." Then the boy looked toward Sarah and whispered something so soft they both leaned closer. "Don't cry, Mommy," he said faintly. "I'll be okay." Sarah bit her lip, trying to stay strong. "You'll get better, sweetheart. Just rest." But they all knew the truth. The doctor's words had sealed it. There was no medicine left to try. That night, after the nurse dimmed the lights and left them alone, Sarah sat quietly at the corner of the room, staring at the boy she had raised like her own. The steady rhythm of the machines filled the silence. Robert had fallen asleep on the chair, exhaustion finally catching him, but Sarah couldn't sleep. Her thoughts wandered back to the first time she met David. He was only a few months old, his mother already gone. The house was full of sadness even then. Robert had buried himself in work, and Sarah had become the one who fed the baby, rocked him to sleep, and kissed him good night. Over the years, she had seen Robert's heart soften, though he never said much. She knew he loved his son more than life itself, but he didn't know how to show it. Now, he sat beside the bed, like a broken man, powerless and lost. Sarah watched him for a long time. In that moment, she realized she couldn't just stand there and wait. 7 days. That wasn't enough. Not for a child like David. Not for the boy who called her Mommy number 2. Her hands trembled as she looked down at him. He was so small, his hair thinner than before, his lips dry. She whispered again, "You're not going anywhere, baby. I won't let you." She didn't know what she could do yet, but she knew she couldn't give up. The rain outside began to fall harder, tapping softly against the window. Sarah pulled her chair closer to the bed and reached for his hand. His fingers were cold, and she wrapped both of her hands around his tiny palm, rubbing gently to keep it warm. Robert stirred in his sleep and opened his eyes. "You should rest," he said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "I can't, sir. Not tonight." He sighed, his eyes tired. "I don't know what else to do." Sarah looked at him, her voice low but firm. "Sometimes it's not about what we can do, sir. It's about what we're willing to do." Robert stared at her, not understanding the meaning behind her words. But Sarah already knew what she was thinking. Deep inside her heart, something had awakened a mix of fear, love, and courage. When the night turned to morning, she stood up and walked to the window. The sun was rising slowly over the city, painting the sky in pale orange. To her, it didn't look like the start of another day. It looked like the start of a fight she had to win. She turned back to look at David, still sleeping, the machines still beeping. She whispered to herself, "I won't lose you. Not like this. Not like this." And for the first time, she made up her mind. She would find a way, no matter what it cost her. The morning sun rose slowly over Houston, washing the hospital windows with a pale light. Inside the room, everything still looked the same, yet something had changed in Sarah Lopez's heart. The doctor's words kept replaying in her head. 7 days. That number didn't sound like time anymore. It sounded like a countdown to pain. Robert had gone home to freshen up and bring new clothes. The nurses came in quietly, checking David's monitors, writing things on papers, whispering in low voices. Sarah stood near the bed, her eyes fixed on the little boy who looked so peaceful, too peaceful. She brushed her fingers across his forehead, whispering a prayer under her breath. "God, if there's anything left to try, please show me." David's hand twitched lightly in his sleep. That small movement gave her strength. She straightened herself, took a deep breath, and made a silent promise. "I'll find a way." Later that afternoon, when Robert returned, Sarah tried to act normal. She brought him coffee, fixed the blanket over David, and stood near the window as he spoke softly with the doctor. The conversation was short, but every word cut deep. "His organs are failing," the doctor said quietly. "We'll keep him comfortable. That's all we can do now." Robert nodded slowly, though his eyes looked empty. "Thank you, doctor," he said, forcing the words out. When the doctor left, he turned toward the window and whispered, "All my money, and I can't save my son." Sarah wanted to say something, but her throat felt tight. She only said, "He needs you to stay strong, sir." Robert nodded, then sat down again. Hours passed in heavy silence, broken only by the beeping of the machines. Sarah's mind was far away. She couldn't stand still anymore. That evening, when Robert stepped out to take a phone call, she quietly reached for her phone. She started searching. Liver disease in children. Possible cures. Experimental treatments. Each result told her the same thing: too late, too advanced, too hopeless. But she didn't stop. Her hands shook as she typed another search. Can someone give part of their liver to a child? This time, she found something different. It was an article about living donor transplants. It said that sometimes a healthy person could give a small part of their liver to someone sick, and both could survive. The liver could grow back. The words looked like light in a tunnel. Sarah's heart started to beat faster, not with fear, but with hope. She read everything carefully, even though she barely understood the medical terms. She learned that for it to work, the donor and patient had to be a match the same blood type, same tissue markers. Usually, it worked best between family members. Sarah looked up at David, lying small and quiet on the bed. She wasn't family by blood, but in her heart, she was his mother. If there was even the smallest chance she could help, she had to try. The next morning, Sarah made up her mind. She told the nurse she needed to step out for an hour. She took the bus to a small clinic across town, a place she had found online that offered blood tests for donors. The nurse at the counter asked why she wanted the test. "It's for someone special," Sarah said softly. The nurse didn't ask more questions. They drew her blood, took her information, and told her to come back in a few days. When she walked out of the clinic, she felt lighter, like she had finally taken the first step. That night, she returned to the hospital, pretending nothing was different. Robert was sitting by the bed, his face pale with exhaustion. She offered him a cup of tea. He looked at her and said, "You've been here every night. Go home, rest a little." Sarah shook her head. "I'll rest when he does, sir." He sighed, looking at her carefully. "You care for him like he's your own." Sarah hesitated, then whispered, "He is my own, sir. Maybe not by blood, but by love." Robert didn't reply. He only looked down, his eyes glistening, then nodded slowly. Later that night, after everyone left, Sarah sat beside David again. The room was dim, the only light coming from the monitor screen. She hummed softly, the same lullaby she used to sing when he was small. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she wiped them away quickly. She couldn't break down now. 2 days passed. David's condition didn't improve. His heartbeat slowed more often. Nurses came and went, but their faces showed no hope anymore. Robert barely spoke. He spent most of his time staring at the window, lost in thoughts that no one could reach. Then, on the third morning, Sarah's phone rang. It was the clinic. Her hands shook as she answered. "Miss Lopez?" a calm voice said. "We have your test results ready. You might want to come in today." Her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to Robert, who was standing by the bed. "Sir, I need to handle something quickly, just for a few hours." He looked at her with tired eyes. "Everything okay?" "Yes, sir. Just something personal." She left quietly and took a cab straight to the clinic. The whole ride, she couldn't stop whispering prayers. When she arrived, the doctor handed her an envelope. Inside were the results, long numbers and medical words she couldn't read. The doctor smiled kindly. "Miss Lopez, you're a full match." Sarah froze. "What?" "Perfect blood type, perfect tissue markers. It's very rare, the doctor said. You could be a living donor for that child you mentioned. Sarah's eyes filled instantly. She pressed her hand to her chest and nodded. Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much. When she stepped outside, the wind hit her face, and she looked up at the sky. God, you answered me, she whispered. You gave me the chance. On the way back to the hospital, her mind raced. She wanted to tell Robert, but something held her back. She knew how he would react. He would say no, too risky, too dangerous. But she didn't care about danger. She had already made up her mind. If she could save David, she would, even if it cost her everything. When she entered the hospital room again, Robert was asleep in the chair. She placed her bag quietly on the table and walked to the bed. David stirred slightly, opening his eyes halfway. "Mommy number 2, he whispered weakly. You came back." Sarah bent down, kissed his forehead, and smiled. "I'll always come back, baby. I promise." He smiled faintly, then closed his eyes again. Sarah stood there in silence for a long time. She pulled out the paper from her bag and looked at it. Her hands were shaking, but her heart was steady. She folded it carefully and hid it inside her purse. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the lights of Houston fade as the city went quiet. Inside her chest, fear and courage fought side by side, but one thought kept her strong. If this is the only way, then I'll do it. The next morning began with the smell of coffee and quiet footsteps. Nurses moved in and out of the room, checking machines and replacing IV bags. The air felt heavy, the kind of silence that came when people had already given up. Sarah Lopez sat by David's bed, her hands resting gently on his blanket. His breathing had become slower. His lips looked dry and cracked, and every time he tried to move, a soft moan escaped his mouth. Each sound tore something inside her chest. She leaned close and whispered, "Mommy number 2 is right here, my love. You're going to be fine." She wanted to believe her own words, but deep inside, she was scared. Scared that she was running out of time. Scared that if she didn't act soon, 7 days would become 6, then 5, and then none. When Robert Wilson entered the room, his eyes were tired and red. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night talking to doctors, searching for someone, anyone, who could still help. But every call ended the same way. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson. There's nothing else we can do." He sat beside his son, placing a shaking hand on the small shoulder. "Good morning, champ," he said softly. David didn't answer. His eyes stayed closed, his breathing shallow. Robert looked at Sarah. "He barely wakes up now," he said, his voice breaking. "They say his liver is shutting down completely." Sarah nodded, then took a deep breath. "Sir, there's something I need to tell you." Robert looked at her, confused. "What is it?" She pulled out the folded paper from her bag, the test result she had kept hidden since yesterday. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. "I went to a clinic, sir. I got tested to see if I could be a donor for David." Robert froze. "What?" "I had to try," Sarah said quickly, her voice shaking. "I couldn't just sit here and watch him fade away. I found out I'm a perfect match, sir. My blood type, my tissue, everything." Robert's eyes widened, disbelief spreading across his face. You did this without telling me?" "I did," she said quietly, "because I knew you would stop me." He stood up, his voice louder now. "Of course I would stop you. Sarah, this is insane. You're not family. You could die from this. Do you even understand what you're saying?" Sarah rose to her feet, tears spilling down her face. "I understand, sir. I understand better than anyone. I know the risk. I know what could happen. But I also know what will happen if I don't try. He'll die. And I'll never forgive myself." Robert ran his hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. No hospital will allow this. The law doesn't permit donations from people who aren't blood-related or legal guardians." "I know," Sarah whispered, "but I have to try. There must be someone willing to listen. Someone who cares more about saving a life than signing papers." Robert turned sharply, his voice filled with pain. "Sarah, please. I already lost my wife. I can't lose you too. You're all David has left besides me." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wet but strong. "Then let me save him. Please, sir. Let me do this. He's my child too." Her words hung in the air. The room went quiet again, except for the soft sound of David's breathing. Robert sat down, holding his head in his hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, he said in a low voice, "Even if I said yes, no hospital here will take you. It's against the rules. They'd call it illegal." Sarah stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then I'll find one that will." Robert looked up at her in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am," she said. "There has to be a doctor somewhere who'll see what this is not about rules, but about love." Robert sighed heavily. "Sarah, you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied softly. "If I can give him a part of me and he lives, then it's worth it. If I don't try, then I'll live with guilt forever." She folded the test result carefully and placed it on the table near him. "You can tear it if you want, sir, but my mind is made up." She turned away and walked toward the window, staring out at the city. The tall buildings looked peaceful in the morning light, yet she felt nothing but restlessness. Her reflection on the glass looked tired, but her eyes carried something fierce determination. Behind her, Robert sat silently, staring at the paper. He didn't know what to say. For years, he had believed that money could fix anything. But now, standing in front of a woman with nothing, he saw real strength, something he had never been able to buy. That afternoon, Sarah went to the hospital administration office. She asked to meet the head of the transplant team. A nurse led her into a small office where two doctors sat behind a desk. She explained everything: the test results, her connection to David, her willingness to donate. When she finished, the older doctor sighed and said, "Miss Lopez, we're deeply moved by your heart, but rules are rules. You're not legally related to the patient. We can't perform the surgery." Sarah leaned forward, desperation in her voice. "Please, he's just a child. If there's even a small chance, why not take it?" The doctor shook his head. "If something went wrong, we'd lose our licenses. We could be sued. I'm sorry." Sarah's voice broke. "You don't understand. He calls me Mommy. He's my world." The younger doctor looked away, his eyes filled with pity, but he didn't speak. Sarah realized the answer wouldn't change. She stood slowly, tears filling her eyes. "Thank you for your time," she said softly, then walked out. Outside, the wind blew against her face. She stood by the hospital entrance, her hands shaking. For a moment, she felt lost, small, and helpless. Then her phone buzzed with a message from one of the nurses inside. "He's asking for you." Her heart jumped. She ran back through the halls until she reached the room. David was awake, his small voice calling weakly, "Mommy number 2." Sarah rushed to his side, kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here, my love." He smiled faintly, his eyelids heavy. "You look sad." She brushed his hair gently. "No, baby. I'm just tired." "Are you mad at Daddy?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, sweetheart, I'm not mad at anyone." David tried to lift his hand. She took it carefully, kissing his fingers. He whispered, "Mommy, when I get better, can we go to the park again?" Her throat tightened. She forced a smile. "Yes, baby. We'll go to the park. You'll see the ducks again." He nodded slowly, his voice fading. "Promise?" "I promise," she whispered. As he drifted back to sleep, Sarah turned toward the window again. The sky was turning orange with sunset, and her reflection stared back at her, tired, scared, but determined. If the hospital wouldn't help her, she would find another way. Somewhere in the world, there had to be someone who understood that love was stronger than any law. That night, when everyone had gone to sleep, Sarah opened her old phone and searched again. This time, she typed, "Doctors who accept living donors with no family relation. Emergency liver transplant overseas. Private hospitals accepting last-stage cases." Each link gave her new hope. She would not stop now. The night sky over Houston was dark and quiet, but Sarah Lopez sat awake by the hospital window, her eyes fixed on the city lights far below. She had been searching for hours, scrolling through articles and medical forums on her small old phone. Each link brought her closer to something that looked like hope. Her hands trembled as she opened one more website. It was a small children's medical center overseas. The headline read, "Living Donor Miracles When Love Becomes Medicine." Sarah read every line carefully, even though the words were hard to understand. The article told of a doctor who had saved children with no family donors, using compassion as his rule, not policy. His name was Dr. Samuel Rahim, and his hospital was known for accepting hopeless cases that others rejected. Sarah sat still for a long moment, then whispered to herself, "This is it." She filled out the online form slowly, typing her name, David's condition, and attaching photos of her test results. At the end, it asked for a message. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she began to write. Is greater than, "Dear Doctor, I am a maid. The child I care for is dying. I am not his mother by blood, but he calls me Mommy. I was tested, and I am a match. No hospital here will take me because I am not family. Please, if there's any chance, help us. I will do anything." When she pressed send, her hands were shaking. She looked over at David, who was asleep, his little chest rising slowly with each breath. "I'll find a way, my love," she whispered. By morning, a new email appeared. Her heart raced as she opened it. It was from Dr. Rahim himself. "Is greater than Miss Lopez. I read your message. I'm deeply moved. I lost my own daughter years ago, and since then I've dedicated my life to helping children like David. If you are healthy and ready for the risk, I will accept you as a donor. Come quickly. We'll handle the rest quietly." Sarah's hand covered her mouth as tears fell. For the first time in days, she felt light. There was a way. It was dangerous, maybe even impossible, but it was a chance. That afternoon, she waited for Robert Wilson to step out for a meeting with the hospital director. Once the door closed, she moved fast. She spoke with one of the nurses, Nurse Elena, who had always treated her kindly. "Elena," Sarah whispered, "I need your help." The nurse frowned. "With what?" Sarah told her everything about the test results, the rejection, the foreign doctor, and the plan to fly out before it was too late. Elena's eyes widened. "Sarah, this is risky. If anyone finds out, you could get in serious trouble." "I don't care," Sarah said. "I can't just stand by and watch him die." The nurse hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you, but you need to be careful." That evening, Elena helped her arrange private transport through a medical contact who could fly them overseas quietly. The flight was set for 2 days later. Sarah spent the next 48 hours preparing everything in secret. She packed small bags, one with her clothes, one with David's favorite toy and his medical records. She made sure to bring his blanket, the blue one he had used since he was 2. She also wrote a letter to Robert. "Is greater than, sir, by the time you read this, will be gone. Please forgive me. I know you told me not to do this, but I can't let him go without trying. If I don't make it back, tell David I said yes." Sarah. On the morning of the flight, the hospital felt unusually quiet. Robert was in a meeting on the other floor. Sarah knew this was her only chance. With Nurse Elena's help, she dressed David in warm clothes and wrapped a small scarf around his neck. He was too weak to ask questions. "Where are we going, Mommy number 2?" he whispered. Sarah smiled softly. "We're going somewhere special, baby. Somewhere that's going to make you feel better." He smiled faintly, his eyes half closed. "Will Daddy come too?" "Not yet," she said gently, brushing his hair. "He'll see you soon." They moved through the back exit of the hospital quietly, helped by 2 nurses who understood what Sarah was doing. Outside, a private ambulance waited. Sarah climbed in, holding David tightly in her arms as the driver started the engine. The vehicle moved through the streets of Houston while rain began to fall again, tapping lightly against the windows. She looked out and whispered a prayer. "God, please watch over us." By afternoon, they reached the private airstrip where a small medical jet waited. The pilot greeted them, asking no questions. David was settled gently onto a reclining seat, a soft blanket over him. Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand the whole time. As the plane began to rise, she looked down at the city fading beneath the clouds. Her heart hurt, thinking about Robert, but she knew she had to do this. The flight was long and quiet. David slept most of the time, breathing softly. At one point, he opened his eyes and whispered, "Are we going far, Mommy?" Sarah smiled, her voice gentle. "Just far enough to find our miracle." When they landed, it was already dark. A small team from the hospital was waiting at the private terminal. Dr. Rahim himself stood there, his face kind but serious. "Miss Lopez?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, doctor. This is David." The doctor looked at the boy gently. "He's very weak. We must move quickly." Within minutes, they were taken to a quiet private hospital wing. Everything moved fast but calm. Nurses checked David's vitals, ran new scans, and prepared rooms for both of them. Sarah stayed beside him the entire time, refusing to rest. Before dawn, Dr. Rahim came in with papers for her to sign. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. "The surgery is dangerous. You could lose a lot of blood. You may never be the same again." Sarah met his eyes and nodded. "I understand. I'm not scared, doctor. Please, just save him." The doctor nodded. "Then we begin at sunrise." That night, Sarah sat beside David's bed, brushing her fingers through his thin hair. She whispered, "You're going to live, my love. You'll wake up and see Daddy again. I promise." Before closing her eyes, she took out a small piece of paper and wrote one last note. She slipped it under his pillow. "Is greater than, if I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." Her tears dropped onto the paper, leaving faint marks. In another room, Dr. Rahim and his team prepared for the surgery. The machines were checked, the lights adjusted, the blood supply arranged. The air felt heavy with both fear and faith. When the first light of morning touched the sky, Sarah was taken into one operating room and David into another, just across the hall. Nurses whispered quiet prayers as the doors closed. Outside, the hallway stood still, silent, except for the soft sound of machines being turned on. No one could hear Sarah whisper one last sentence before she fell asleep under anesthesia. "Please, God, let him live." The operating rooms were bright and cold, filled with the soft sound of machines and steady voices. 2 teams worked side by side, one for Sarah Lopez, one for David Wilson. It was still early morning in the quiet hospital overseas, and outside, the sky was gray with mist. Inside, every second mattered. Dr. Samuel Rahim stood between the 2 rooms, moving back and forth as the surgery began. His face was calm, but his eyes showed the weight of what was happening. He had promised Sarah he would try everything, and he meant it. As the anesthesia settled in, Sarah's body relaxed. The doctors marked her side and began carefully. Piece by piece, they removed a small portion of her healthy liver. It was delicate work, every cut measured, every move guided by steady hands. In the next room, another team waited beside the small boy who had less than a week left to live. When the doctor entered, carrying the organ in a sterile dish, the nurses moved quickly. Within seconds, they began the transplant. Hours passed slowly. The hallway outside remained empty, silent, and tense. Nurses walked carefully, whispering short updates to one another. Everyone knew the risk. No one wanted to speak of failure. Back in Texas, Robert Wilson had just landed from his flight. He had received a call in the middle of the night, a call that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Wilson," a woman's voice said, "your maid and your son have been admitted to our hospital overseas. They're both in surgery." At first, he thought it was a cruel joke, but when he checked the message again, his heart dropped. The hospital name matched the one Sarah had mentioned days ago. He didn't even pack a bag. He called his pilot and left immediately, not caring about meetings, money, or headlines. The flight felt endless. By the time Robert reached the hospital, the surgeries had just finished. He ran through the hallways like a man chasing life itself, asking everyone he saw for directions. When he finally reached the recovery wing, the nurse pointed toward two adjoining rooms. Inside the first, little David lay on the bed, wrapped in soft white sheets, connected to tubes and machines. His small chest moved gently, his face peaceful. For the first time in weeks, his color looked better. His heart monitor showed a strong, steady rhythm. In the next room, Sarah was still unconscious, her face pale and lips dry. The machines around her beeped softly, reminding everyone how fragile she was. A thin bandage ran along her side where the surgery had been done. Robert stood between both rooms, unable to move. His throat tightened as tears filled his eyes. He whispered, "Oh God, what have you done, Sarah?" Dr. Rahim walked in quietly and rested a hand on his shoulder. "She saved him," the doctor said softly. "The transplant was successful. Both are stable for now. But she lost a lot of blood. We'll need to watch her closely." Robert nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "She risked her life for my son." "Yes," the doctor replied. "Not for reward, not for attention. She said she was his mother, and she meant it." Robert walked into Sarah's room, his steps slow. He stood beside her, looking down at the woman who had done what no one else could. For years, he had treated her like part of the staff, someone who worked quietly in the background. But now he saw her for who she truly was, a mother, a protector, a hero. He sat beside her bed, took her hand gently, and whispered, "You saved the only thing that keeps me alive. If you wake up, I'll never let you go through pain again." Hours turned into days. David's condition improved faster than anyone expected. The new liver began to function perfectly. The doctors called it a miracle. His fever dropped, his color returned, and his breathing became steady. Every nurse who passed his room smiled quietly. But Sarah remained asleep. The hospital grew used to seeing Robert sitting beside both rooms, moving back and forth every few hours, whispering prayers under his breath. One morning, 5 days after the surgery, something changed. A small voice broke the silence in David's room. "Daddy?" Robert looked up from his chair, frozen. He rushed to the bed, his eyes wide. "David, son, you're awake!" The boy blinked slowly, his voice weak but clear. "I'm hungry." Robert laughed through tears. "You can have whatever you want, champ. Anything." Then David looked around and frowned. "Where's mommy number 2? Robert hesitated, his throat tightening again. "She's resting, son. She's very tired." "I want to see her," David said softly. You will, Robert whispered. You will. Soon. Later that afternoon, Robert went to Sarah's room again. He sat down beside her, holding her hand. The steady beep of the machine filled the air. He spoke quietly, even though she couldn't answer. Sarah, he's awake. He's asking for you. He's smiling again. Please, open your eyes. Please. His voice broke. He bent his head and stayed there, his forehead resting on her hand. For a long time, the room stayed quiet. Then, just as he was about to stand, he felt a faint movement. Sarah's fingers twitched. Robert looked up quickly. Her eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. Sarah, he said, his voice trembling, you're awake. Her lips moved, her voice faint. Is he okay? Robert smiled through tears. He's more than okay. You saved him. A weak smile spread across her face, tears slipping down her cheeks. Thank God, she whispered. Just then, the door opened, and a nurse wheeled in a small chair. Sitting in it was David, his face brighter than it had been in months. When he saw Sarah, he gasped and reached out his small hands. Mommy number 2! Sarah's tears flowed freely. She tried to sit up, and Robert quickly supported her back. David reached forward, hugging her weakly. I told you I'd come back, Sarah whispered. You did it, Mommy, David said softly. You made me live. The nurse wiped her eyes quietly before leaving the room to give them space. Days later, the story spread through the hospital. The staff called it the Houston Miracle. Reporters began calling, but Robert refused interviews. He told them, this isn't a story about money, it's about love. When the doctors confirmed that both Sarah and David were fully stable, Robert brought them back to Texas. The return felt like a celebration. The once quiet mansion was filled with laughter again. Nurses visited, neighbors brought gifts, and everyone wanted to see the boy who had lived. Weeks passed, and Sarah healed slowly. Her steps were careful, but her smile returned. Every evening, David sat beside her on the porch, holding her hand, asking for stories. Robert often joined them, no longer the cold man he used to be. One evening, as the sun set over the Texas hills, Robert placed a framed letter on the table beside them. It was the one Sarah had written before leaving. If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes. He looked at her and said softly, this letter changed everything. You gave up your life to save mine, Sarah. Not just my son's, but mine too. Thank you will never be enough. Sarah smiled gently. You don't have to thank me, sir. He's my child too. Robert nodded, emotion filling his voice. You're not my maid anymore. You're family. Sarah looked away shyly, her eyes full of quiet tears. As night fell, laughter echoed through the house. David played in the yard, running with his small toy plane, his voice full of life. Sarah watched him with a soft smile, her hand resting over her side where the scar still ached faintly. The pain didn't bother her. It was a reminder of love, of the moment she chose courage over fear, life over rules. The story of what she did continued to inspire people across the world. Hospitals changed their laws, allowing emotional donors in emergency cases. People called her an angel, but Sarah never wanted fame. She always said the same thing. I don't need my name on anything. My reward is seeing him live. A year later, on David's 7th birthday, the Wilson mansion was full again, balloons, cake, music, and laughter. Robert stood near the door filming, while Sarah helped David cut the cake. He turned to her and smiled. You gave him back his life, Sarah. She smiled softly. No, sir, love did. David looked up at her, his eyes bright. Mommy number 2, now I'm really going to live, right? Sarah knelt down, her voice calm and warm. Yes, my love. You're going to live." He hugged her tight, and Robert looked on, tears in his eyes. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and laughter, they were no longer a billionaire, a maid, and a child. They were a family. And somewhere deep inside, they all knew the same truth: love had done the impossible. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that love is stronger than money, rules, or fear. A poor maid gave everything she had, even her own body, to save a child who wasn't hers by blood, because real family is made by the heart, not by name. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what lesson you learned from this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can see that miracles still happen when love is real. And if you want more emotional stories like this, comment "more stories" and you'll be the first to get our next one.